Welcome back to our class. Today we're going to cover both Lecture 2 and Lecture 3. And do not worry if you didn't notice any reading introduced for Lecture 3 and Lecture 1, because there is no required reading. There's nonetheless the optional assigned textbook chapter that I already put on Canvas under the module reading cell to highlight that. So if you think that's going to help you with preparing for the quizzes and understanding the lecture content, that is definitely a good idea, but it's completely optional. And if you are able, for example, to cover and understand stuff that was covered in today's lecture or Lecture 3 in particular, no extra effort in terms of reading is required. Although for Lecture 2, when we do have readings required, you should read them. Okay. For Lecture 2, our topic is what do sociologists do and what is sociological thinking? Something that I said that last time already touched upon a little bit, right? So on the one hand, sociology would entail questioning a lot of the assumptions we've always been taken for granted. For example, the fact that today everybody has a cell phone of some sort. What was life before cell phone like? Right? Have you guys been experiencing that? Or probably if your parents don't allow you to use them, or what was it like when cell phones were hard dialed number and barely any screen, right? Or today when we're thinking about sociology work, especially if some of you are doing in STEM subjects and familiar in any way or heard of like quantitative science, you will know that, right, people will be working with a computer at least or some type of software, right? You probably have heard of something like programming as well. But you know, one generation ago, a lot of these so-called statistical models and processes, we have to be actually using physical cards, and to tap them into a machine. And it could take days or even months for some of these processes to go through. So think about all of these things, everyday life in us that we're so used to, right? And how life could be so different, or what we're used to be to can be so surprising to people in other cultures and other time points. And also in the same time, same culture, but different locations within the social hierarchy, right? Think about, for example, the comfort of what you're having today versus a lot of people might be struggling with food. If, for example, you're homeless, actually, I was homeless once when I was in England doing my master's. I just didn't feel I had enough money to pay for rent or pay for go to a hotel. So I literally had to sleep like in the library for some nights. A lot of us are very actually close to that, so probably you guys are not. And I know Cornell kids who come to Cornell are super wealthy. Probably not me, right? And then life, if I'm struggling, for example, with thinking about, oh, where am I going to sleep today? To what extent can I even worry so much about, oh, what are all those assignments that are in this class, and how can I get an A in it? All of those questions, they still kind of matter, but like their priority for me would kind of fall into the background a little bit. And think about all of these different issues and circumstances in the world, or even in your world, once you start to develop your sociological thinking through your sociological imagination, right? What we're going to touch today. But then you're going to also want some analytical tools in a disciplined way to study these phenomena. And that's what we're going to be covered in 2 lectures in a way, like lecture 4, I think, about research methods. But in general, as we also mentioned last time, sociology is the scientific study of the social world. And also importantly, all of these definitions here are actually quite good definitions. It's just that this one might be the most accurate and succinct. But think a little bit more again when we're assigning Berger's reading. One goal there is to help us understand what sociology is by thinking about what it isn't, or things that we usually associate with what sociologists do, and yet not exactly what sociology is about. Okay, for example, can we distinguish between sociology, social worker, and social science at this point? Can we? We're going to first cover some of these differences, and hopefully you've done the readings, so all of this will be familiar to you. And something else, which is sociology and its relationship with other social sciences. And we're going to also let you know what social science means. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's the goal of sociological inquiry before we jump into the sociological imagination. Poll time. What do you think? You can pause, or it's up to you what you would say. Is it a science? Okay, according to, and now again, survey time to examine your own reading. According to Berger, the difference between sociology and social work is that, which one? Yeah. C, right? So sociology is an attempt to understand, while social work is a practice. Well, what does that mean? So sociologists very often are called upon to provide guidance, evidence, and help so that people who are doing social work, the social workers, could better serve a community, right? That is true. And yet, to be a sociologist in itself, the goal is to understand society, to have insights about people's behavior. And importantly, according to Berger's examples, right, these insights that you know about could be used for good or bad purposes. So, for example, when we think about criminology in crimes, right, we know that, and by the way, criminology is actually very closely associated with sociology too. So if we hear of the university, Penn State, Pennsylvania State University, their criminology and sociology are the same department. And the department where I come from, sociology, at Oxford University, criminology is also kind of a subfield, closely related, also a neighboring discipline. Like there are professors who are sociology professors, but at the same time, they're criminology professors. Because why? Well, to understand the behavior of criminals and crime, that is also part of human society, right? But you understanding that, a criminal or someone who wanted to commit crime could also use that information to counteract the efforts at the police side to try to catch who are trying to catch them, right? So we know, like, if you have experience working in the army or the police, sometimes it's a lot harder for the policeman to catch you as a criminal. And that could be one way of knowing that, oh, yes, they have a very deep understanding of people. And also if we watch like Godfather films series, right? To achieve that level of success as gangsters, even within gangs, there are social rules and principles that one is following and orders within this apparent disorder, okay? Actually, I want to quickly share one note. I'm going to write it down here. Street Honest Society, exactly. This is considered probably one of the most accomplished and important sociology work. And this work exactly is documenting Italian immigrant hood gang in the US area, and how there are important social regularities and rules within the apparently, you're the hoodies and you're people who are not following rules, you're deviant people, right? So, and apparently the sociologist who was studying this, whose name is White, he was not trying to intervene in their behavior. His goal was purely to understand, okay? Although others might use that work as an inspiration to do good things for society. Although one thing that we know very well with gangs and criminal groups or systems, for example, is that they tend to proliferate when there is not enough strong government, community level, or state intervention to actually help protect people. If you watch like the Godfather film series, or actually if you read sociologists' work on gangs, that's something that you might start to realize. So, social worker in the act of practicing, in the practice of helping people, not a sociologist, but related to sociologists. Also, sociologists could provide guidance as theoretical mentor for the social worker, yes, but that is not why they are doing the research, okay? It's like the application of their research. One aspect of that could be used for a social worker's job, but it's not meant only for that purpose, okay? So then Berger also argued how sociologists need to be objective and value-free. And we'll talk a little bit more about what this means in a few slides ahead. But importantly, also the second question, for American Sociological Association, which is the largest association in the US for sociologists, a professional association, in our 2019 meeting, the whole meeting theme is engaging social justice for a better world. What do you think Berger would say in response to this? And what do you feel that you want to say in response to this, right? And actually, I think I've given hints to what things could be like in the relationship between sociology and social work. One is more applied and one is not necessarily more theoretical, but interested in the intellectual endeavor and in understanding society in itself, okay? So, and right now we can also see, I guess, in answer to the question I posed in last lecture, right? Being a sociologist, meaning being a social worker, well, you probably have some of the skills, but not necessarily all the skills, and the social worker probably doesn't have some of the skills that a sociologist has if they're trained purely as a social worker. Okay. Also, sociology similarly is not a social reformer, although a lot of times people who are trying to do social reform might my apologies, I was not aware that I wasn't sharing a screen. So this was, I hope you have the slides, so that should be fine for you. But here, so sociologists can be called upon to help with, again, social reform design. And yet, they should not only be studying something so that only if a reform for the better would happen, okay? A lot of times they're just intrinsically interested in certain problems. Although there is, I mean, an important aspect of the impact, the social consequences of what you're studying, that is true. And a lot of the sociologists do, outside of their profession, see themselves as advocates and activists for social causes and for social welfare. And that is kind of related, okay? But sociology as an intellectual and scientific endeavor itself does not require that you have to be interested in making social reform, okay? That's one thing. And another thing is sociology just also are not just the gatherer of statistics of human behavior. So we do use a lot of statistical or like quantitative information about a lot of people to see regularities in them. But that kind of study in itself does not make sociology. Why? Because it is not married yet, okay, to the sociological perspective or sociological imagination or sociological theories that actually we're going to be covering very soon. And we're going to be talking about different domains of research that are all inspired by sociological imagination that kind of foster these different areas of sociological theories. Let me give you an example, okay? If the sociological lens, the sociological perspective means that, oh, we should think of things not only from an individualistic point of view and think that everything that happens to me is because of what I choose to do, yes, but also my choices, right, are conditioned in historical, cultural, and social contexts. And depending also on my social position within the world, right, and my social relations to other people. If that is true, right, we can see that is the general sociological imagination and perspective. And then what happens is that, okay, that's quite a general thing. What about, what happens when I use it to understand, for example, health outcomes, mental health? Then we might see, oh, maybe social connectedness, maybe social support, and maybe the fact that we're not having stressful jobs, and also the fact that we're not experiencing a lot of discrimination because of our skin color or something in society. Systematically, we're much less to suffer from these mental health issues, which is actually a case, okay, in empirical research, unfortunately, in the US, that certain ethnic groups just have worse health outcomes than like white individuals, for example. So that is applying, but then that observation in itself over time, we can develop theories about that kind of findings themselves, but they're still kind of embedded more broadly, inspired by sociological perspective, okay, and applied to different domains. So, but the fact in itself, if we don't have it wrapped up in a theoretical framework, then that's not sociology, that's data exercise. Okay. So, what is a sociologist? Well, someone who's very interested in understanding, first of all, understanding society, but also in a disciplined way. What does it mean to be in a disciplined way? Or Bergam mentioned something like objective and value-free. Well, what does that even mean, right? So that means to control your own personal preferences and prejudice, to perceive clearly rather than to judge normatively. So there is a distinction here between descriptive and normative, or empirical and normative. Being normative is to think about what one should do versus should not do. Okay? Whereas descriptive is just, I try to understand what's going on by describing and by explaining things. Okay, that's description. So here we're really saying, and this is true with sociologists, that, for example, we should not impose our judgment on the topic that we're studying without disciplined, systematic evidence on what we're claiming. Okay, so let us make an example about this. Say we believe, and that is a quite natural belief, that if we can build, for example, more rehabilitation centers for people who previously were incarcerated, and when we release them and we can provide them with more social support and network support systems, right, and connect them to their family, we believe that if we're doing some community level work like that, and with collaboration, or we can ourselves in our pastime serve as social workers, this might help, right, with the social cause. Yes, that is a very typically like, we're all for like good things in society kind of idea, and that's very important as missionary and ministry for sociologists. That's true, or at least those who are interested in this. But on the other hand, conducting sociological research, and you are saying, oh, my research would be, I'm going to be set up all of these community centers. I'm going to design what they will look like, right? And I'm going to best serve the people. I'm going to know how to serve them. Is that sociological research? That's not sociological research. What would sociological research be like? Well, a typical research would then try to understand and assess, for example, will setting up these community centers actually help with people's rehabilitation? That is a scientific question, okay? And if, for example, in my observations, even with the best intentions, and I'm like, no, actually, there are a lot of things going on, like people, it's not because that they don't have enough information, but because there's not enough access. They feel too internally kind of subjugated and don't want to come out of their place, or it's because of something else, right? Or people mainly just don't have access to jobs, and maybe that is what we should focus on. That is then sociological research, because when we're seeing evidence, first of all, we're looking for evidence to observe patterns, but secondly, what happens when the evidence does not support what we thought was a good cause? That's very important too, right? Then we're trying to provide actually evidence-based assessment of social projects. But we can also, for example, actually just study something that we're intensely, shamelessly interested in terms of the doing of men, without necessarily a social impact cause. So for example, last time when I mentioned the idea of making the familiar strange, I gave the very mundane examples of, for example, the fact that we seem dressed to certain type of etiquette, right? I have to be decent. I can't use like curse words, even though I might, like in private, right, with friends and family, I have to put on a certain persona as a professor or instructor in front of the camera, right? And for example, despite me today, actually, I recorded this once already, only to realize that I never clicked on the recording when I finished. So I had to be recording all of this lecture again. And psychologically, that could, you know, that's not a nice feeling for me. And yet I have to seem happy and passionate and enthusiastic, because, you know, if even I feel bored, as the instructor, I'm sure you watching me will feel terribly bored, right? So, and all of these social roles, for example, that I'm playing, and these concepts like social roles, etiquette, performance, right? Do these things necessarily help us like give any social reform of any kind or do any welfare as we traditionally understand? Probably not. Are these sociology? Yes. Yes. Because this is a way of conceptualizing the world that we take for granted and to apply the sociological perspective by thinking about how our behaviors are conditioned by our social environment, right? And social conditions, right? So that is sociology, okay? And actually, as Berger said, if you cannot find at least 3 explanations for any type of behavior you observe in human beings, you should probably find another job. You shouldn't be a sociologist. So these people should be very interested in why people do certain things and like what they're doing and how and why, right? Okay. And then we're going to jump into a little bit of explanation of the relationship between sociology and the other social sciences. But first of all, what is social science and social study, right? Sociology sounds also similar. Yes, they're quite similar, I have to say. And what they do all together, all of these can be social sciences, okay, is that we're trying to understand something about people. Sometimes we call them the human sciences, right? We're studying people. And also, we're trying to apply some form of systematic, disciplined methods to this type of study, regardless of what method in itself or evidence would mean. So, for instance, for history, maybe a quote from one narrator, one historical figure could be very important form of evidence. Whereas maybe for a sociologist, sometimes we're not necessarily buying into that kind of evidence, although some people in sociology would, others might not. It could be a little more controversial. Whereas sociologists might think, okay, maybe if you give me some would say like quantitative figures, right? All of these different people summed together, what do they look like? It's a more common way in sociology to think about it. Or it could be, you give me a lot of people's comments, right? These qualitative documentation of your interviews or ethnography, then people are more convinced. But if you present these numbers to a historian and they're like, maybe that is a little too shallow, does the number really tell me something? You know, so but on the surface or in general, we're all interested in at least looking at certain types of evidence with a lot of overlap between what we understand as evidence, but also, as I said, some difference. Some might buy this as evidence, whereas other disciplines don't. And we're using that disciplined way of understanding for our advancement of knowing society and knowing people, okay? And within all of these disciplines, actually sociology, anthropology, political science, econ, and psychology might be like the closest. Whereas communication studies is a discipline, I would say more applied when we're doing media studies and human-computer interaction, so that a lot of times, if you're a sociology major, a PhD, and you did something about media studies and you said, oh, I want to apply for a job in communication, you probably can get a job. But if you did your PhD in communication and you want to I want to apply for a PhD in like a professorship in sociology, that could be slightly harder. And sociology and anthropology are the closest. Okay, and actually in China and in France, traditionally these two disciplines are considered as the kind of closely intertwined or identical, like shouldn't be separated. at all, okay? Except that anthropologists care a little bit more about people who are in more so-called primitive states, but mostly meaning non-modern, as seen from the European perspective, like non-industrialized societies, whereas sociology is more interested in industrialized societies. That's the only difference. Whereas we are today gonna talk a little bit more about sociology, economics, and psychology, and how they're similar but also different. Okay, and for political science, okay, this is also clear. Political science are interested in like larger things, like the state, voters, that kind of problems per se. Okay, and they also have their own another tradition of doing classical political philosophy. And these two like very different, seemingly very different strands within contemporary American political science form the discipline. And sociologists could be studying a problem of political science, and political scientists could be studying a problem within sociology too. They sometimes would publish in our journals as well, okay? But within sociology and economics, there's also a lot of overlap. So for example, we're all interested in human society, and we're also interested in problems like income, right? Poverty, Gini coefficient, income inequality, wealth, all of that, yes. However, we do have different understanding classically or generally about human nature and how we go about studying a lot of problems. So first of all, economists consider human nature as rational, self-interested, or people who are atomic maximizers of their utility. What is maximizer of utility? Well, it means like you calculate what's your cost and what's the return or benefit of a certain action. And that is the only reason why you're going to decide, oh, I'm going to do this or I'm going to not do that. Okay. And it kind of also receives that your preferences will intrinsically always be oriented toward your own, like you're trying to maximize what you have, okay? Whereas in sociology, we assume that people's motivations are a lot more complex. Complex in the sense that our beliefs about what is worthy, what is valuable, varies depending on the historical and cultural context. Okay, so the context is really, really important. And also when we are behaving, even within the economic market, for example, in economic transactions, even when sociologists do study that, even when we study that, we take into account the social aspects of such transactions. What does that mean? Well, for example, think about in every culture, we have that. In Chinese, do I have that? Just 1 second, I'm going to find it. I'm going to show you. Just found this. Let me make sure I am recording. Yes. Look at that. What is this? Well, this is a wrapper, also called red pocket, that in China, when there are festivals, in particular, for example, the Spring Festival, which is the most important, like Christmas in China, which is the Lunar New Year. Usually seniors, like people who are older generation in a family, would be giving money, cash, that is wrapped up inside some really delicately made these pockets, and the cash will be inside, and you would never see how much money there is, but they would be giving you that. And we do certain things like this for going to weddings as well. If you're a wedding guest, it is not that you just go there and with nothing. You actually do bring something like that. And yet, if we think about it, why, if it's just about the money that we are giving, right? Why does it have to have so nicely wrapped, and this is not the nicest, but there are nicer ones, nicely wrapped like gift packages. And the same thing happens in the US, right? During Christmas, I should show you a picture here, but you know what we're talking about, right? All of those gift wrappers, and it has to be like, oh, before never open until 25th or something, and after the 26th, the meaning of those gifts completely change, right? And even when we're giving our grandson some cash, like Amazon gift cards, it cannot just be, I'm gonna Venmo you some money. Not like that. We're gonna have to like make it look nice. Even electronically, there are gonna be some celebration and nice words there. Why? Think about that. And why do we need so delicate gift wrapping? Well, because there are meanings embedded in these gifts. It's not just about me lending, like giving you this money for free. No, it is about the giving in itself that matters. And the fact that I'm showing you that, look, I'm paying attention. I'm dedicating a lot of my effort and heart into this gift to show you that I do care. That matters. And can we say that this is economic transition? Of course, it involves money, but is it economic transition as we usually would think of as in rational, commercialized transition? No, right? So that is one example, but we can also think about how a lot of times when people are actual businessmen doing business, do we actually think that what binds them together, repeated transactions, it's all about you giving a price, I'm trying to you pay the money, I give you the, I sell you something, right? You try to buy it, and then you're gonna try to increase the price, I'm gonna try to lower it, and over time and stuff to maximize our individual benefit. Yes, that's probably what's going on. And then we sign a contract and we follow everything on the contract on paper. But really, no, not all the time. Not the most critical factor. According to a lot of these, today we have economic sociologists who are studying this phenomenon. And also, if you grow up in China and a lot of other cultures, for example, it will be very familiar to you. What matters is what? The actual friendship between these people. And also, you're gonna, it can't be that you give them a bunch of cash and say, hey, can you just recommend me more clients? No, it's not, it doesn't work like that. They have to like you as a person, and you have to happen to like the same type of restaurants that you happen to be taking them there sometimes, right? So we have complex motivations because some of this is an interaction between, for example, me using my money as a gift to show that I care, but it's also about the showing of me caring. That's probably more important than the money that I'm spending, right? But if I'm not spending any money, then probably they can reasonably doubt that I'm probably not really caring unless I'm doing some kind of labor, making something for myself, like crafty stuff that has socially labeled recognized value as well. And then that will show that I care, okay? So this is how value itself, even in monetary term, is socially defined, okay? And there's never been a truly utility maximizer in a sense of extreme rationality as the ideal kind of economic model would be thinking about. Instead, we are socially and culturally oriented actors, okay? So in terms of methods as well, in economics, Usually the methods are quantitative, mathematical, and formal, because everything could be calculated, counted, right? But in sociology, we use more diverse types of methods, quantitative and qualitative, as well as a combination of these or other type of methods. Okay. Then sociology and psychology. So psychology focuses more on the individual and sometimes small group levels, mostly individuals. Sociology, on the other hand, are interested in the collective level patterns and behavior. So, for example, in terms of what type of topic these disciplines could be studying, both might be interested in small group choices. So, for example, do we have certain cognitive biases as when we hear other people say the answer should be A, and they're sitting right next to us, and we're gonna say maybe it should be C, but he said A, so maybe A is right too, right? Actually, that was a psychological, and it's called social psychological, okay, that's an overlap, experiment that I just described. Some people do conform to group norms, but a lot of times, though, there are distinct topics that these disciplines are interested in. Psychology, traditionally, you have to be studying, also know about the neurological and the biological structure, the chemical makeup of your brain and the body. And there's a clinical aspect to it. And there's also, for example, childhood trauma of this individual, their growing up environment, that could be really important, and their personality, right? That psychologists are interested in. Whereas for sociologists, those topics might be a little bit too individual level, and we also can be studying a lot more macro level and collective level things up to the state or the whole world, the globalization. And we always are seeking institutional level, cultural and historical kind of explanations. Okay. So the goal of sociological inquiry in sum is to describe patterned social behavior. Patterned meaning there are certain groups that demonstrate this kind of behavior, and another group that demonstrate that type of behavior. Give an example. There could be, we will consistently observe in different countries too, and across time, gender differences in rates of suicide. Men kill themselves more than women on average, okay? Whereas women have more suicidal ideation and are more likely to be depressed than men. This doesn't mean that this would apply to necessarily to your mother and to, for example, your people that you know, right? No, it means on a collective level, when we aggregate people's responses, that is a pattern that we see. Okay, so that is to describe a pattern. But then importantly, we're trying to explain these patterns, and we're not using intrinsically, for example, biological explanations, geographical explanation. Is it because it's the climate that's different, right? Or is it because some people just have certain genetics than others? Those can be important explanations, right, for this particular example, like gender difference and suicide, but that's not the type of explanations that sociologists are interested in. We instead are interested in particularly in social explanations. That is, we use another type of social pattern to explain this social pattern that we observe. Okay, so for example, we might see one thing that we could be seeing is that there are more men, they benefit more from marital relationships in terms of their health than women do. And women tend to have slightly larger close friendship network than men once they're married. That might be and that might be one reason why, for instance, men benefit more from social support from their marriage than women do. And they also suffer a lot more when their partner or their wife passes than when, for example, a woman's husband or their partner passes. And this is all well documented, like patterns that we see. And in terms of, for instance, the difference in gender suicide rates, this could be some explanation is that men might take more lethal, more risky behavior and use more lethal means to try to commit suicide if they do at all. That's why they succeed. Whereas even though women might have more suicidal ideation, they tend not, or they tend to complete suicide, meaning they actually kill themselves successfully less than men do. And these are ways that we are explaining such behavior, okay, using other social patterns, pattern behavior to explain pattern behavior. And explanation in a lot of ways is a little harder than describing the patterns, okay? Although both are extremely important goals for sociologists. And the third one, okay, a lot of times, what I just said, all of the group level, that is kind of the mainstream, but it's also importantly, we have to have a lot of data on different people to come to those observations. Whereas a lot of times for qualitative researchers, as we will mention, it's also important to interpret and understand the process of people's choices. For example, what kind of meaning and value and sense-making processes that people go through in terms of why they're doing certain things that they do. And that kind of research, despite it being seemingly descriptive, can be extremely revealing in helping us understand exactly what is going on the ground. Okay. And now, finally, we're thinking about C. Wright Mills and his book, The Sociological Imagination. He was American, and he worked at Columbia University as both in sociology, but also he was known as a social critic. I hope that you could get a taste of that when you're reading his first chapter, because apparently he had a lot of beliefs about what we should do as social scientists, right? What's the most important goal for all of this intellectual endeavor? What kind of crisis that we're having in modern society, and especially modern America, right? That is all of that. But here, we're particularly interested in what he mentioned in terms of the interplay of man, society, and the biography and history. So what was he referring to there, okay? And here the answer is yes, the third one, right? The third one. And if you don't understand why, you can understand at the end of it. So one thing that Mills kept saying in terms of the sociological imagination is to help us understand how many of the outcomes and behaviors that seem totally personal to us are actually affected, conditioned by external societal forces. And sociological imagination can help us think in a more structural way and just think of ourselves not just as individualistic actors, but actors that are socially, culturally, and historically oriented. And our most intimate choices that we make a lot of times are still so surprisingly similar to the mentalities of other people during similar social conditions. And if so many people within the same society at the same time are having the same personal problems or personal troubles, right? We still think of this as our personal problems, and yet in a way it has a structural conditioning, it has a structural basis to it, which Mills called them public issues. So one example, think about unemployment. If, for example, in a town of 5,000, there is only one person who got unemployed, the fact that he was unemployed probably had to do with his specific skills or character or his way of doing things, right? Then that is his personal trouble, or maybe the family he grows up in, all of those same factors, or he's just unlucky on it. But what if in a town of 50 million, there's 15 million people that are unemployed? Every one of us might think, oh, it's because I'm not competitive enough. My CV is just not fancy enough. I didn't get a good enough education, all of that, or I didn't do well in school. I didn't get enough A's, right? But the sociological imagination, Emil says, or a sociologist will tell you that no. What you think of as your personal trouble, yes, it is your personal trouble within your milieu, but on the other hand, this latter case, there is definitely also a public issue going on. There are structural problems. For example, when there are so many educational expansion in college and everybody's going to college, but at the same time, there are not so many job openings. So overall, of course, there's going to be a lot of people who cannot find jobs as they graduate, right? So let us think about this also. I remember in a stand-up comedian in China made this comment that when he graduated from college, he was told that, you're young and your opportunities are infinite. He believed in that, right? But when he started trying to look for a job, he did still believe in that, but he also found another reality, which is that there are also an infinite number of young people as well who are competing for these seemingly infinite number of opportunities. So when he said that, as a stand-up comedian, everybody laughed who was listening. Why? Because in a way, they resonated, right? So, and you might not have that problem, hopefully. But if we think about it, why is it that during COVID, suddenly a lot of people lose jobs? Do you really think that's their own personal trouble or problem? Or is it a public issue that has structural embeddings, right? And so employment can be one example that we can kind of make sense of what Mills was getting at. And we can also think about things like fertility, right? Low fertility these days in East Asia, in Korea, in China, in Japan, and at least in Korea and China, South Korea and China, for example, there's a lot of anxiety among younger generation people who are at the age of being where they should be having children but are not, right? They worry about the huge investment that would come in raising a baby. And when almost everyone in the same age group in society have similar beliefs, can we still say that the fact that people do probably want children but cannot have them anymore, or just decide that I have to give up on the whole thought of having kids, right? If you are in the US and you are a Gen Z, like the younger generation, at your age, maybe 30-ish or younger, you might want your parents at your age already had kids. And that's a very common thing. And yet at your age, you're living paycheck to paycheck. You're barely thinking about employment stability. And how are you going to even think about marriage or having kids? That becomes your personal trouble, but also what? It's actually a structural problem when you notice that so many of the other Gen Z kids or Gen Z young people are having similar personal troubles. Okay. So this is what sociology is. The sociological imagination allows us to go beyond our personal experiences, but also to relate, more importantly, relate our personal experiences to what? The general social structure and the particular historical environment that we are embedded in, okay? So we can go beyond our individual experiences to a vantage point that shows us how broad social structures influence our lives. Now you can see why it's C, right? In our poll question. So now look again at this question that we did. Remember at the beginning of last lecture, what would you say? Okay. Maybe you will be even clearer about it in a few lectures later. But right now you might think a little bit more about this. Okay, and for next class, we're going to be doing discipline origins and the big five, the five guys and beyond. So the reading is optional here. I recommend it, but it won't be tested. Again, sorry. Thank you. Pause recording and stop.